From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today from Iowa State University, Lee Schulz on the cattle markets. He'll draw from two articles he recently contributed to relating to the market impacts of the COVID-19 situation. One on the cattle price consequences of packing plant closures, the other on the importance of you producers keeping cattle moving through the production stages, even amid the unfavorable market conditions. Also today, K-State's Sandy Johnson on evaluating beef bulls ahead of the spring breeding season via a soundness examination. And later, Jeff Wickman with this week's 4-H segment, where K-State's Wade Weber outlines the decision on suspending in-person 4-H activities until July the 4th. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever wondered why livestock producers burn Kansas pasture? Here's the deal. Controlled burning helps preserve the prairie and allows every bite feeder cattle eat to be the most nutritious. National Wildlife and Parks also feel it is a necessity to help with wildlife populations.
So the next time you see a Kansas pasture burning, know it's for the good of our wildlife, our prairie, and our livestock. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Thanks for tuning in once again for this Agriculture Today. And we open up on the cattle market scene as typical. Joining us via phone from Ames, Iowa, Lee Schulz, livestock economist, Iowa State University. The cattle markets, Lee, are fraught with still more concern as week upon week goes by, and the most recent issue at hand would be the packing plant closures that seem to be mounting as this COVID-19 situation forges ahead. We'll get into that in just a moment. Let's look back, though, at last week's trade, if you will. And the eye-catcher there was the difference between the cash-fed cattle price and what we see in deferred futures contracts. You might speak to that if you would.
Well, overall, we're continuing to see this very strong basis, regardless of what futures contract you're looking at and the cash price being paid. Now, we've certainly eroded that cash price this last week. You know, the last price I seen was on Wednesday at 105 for live trades. You know, that compared to about 112 the week prior. Dress was at about 168. Futures, actually, we did see some positive momentum really across the board, but we're still looking at that June contract trading at 84. And really, I think the issue there, the concern there is as we're seeing this impact and possible further impact to the supply chain, that we're going to see potentially a buildup of fed cattle supplies, and that's really putting a lot of pressure on that June contract, which is less than a month away.
And you have some express thoughts on that potential buildup of cattle and what producers might want to be thinking about as they observe all this. Want to get to that in just a minute, but the packing plant closures, that is most worrisome. In fact, you and your colleague here at K-State, Glenn Tonzer, put together an article responding to packer plant operations and how important it is for those plants to stay in business. We've several plants that have temporarily shut down now, a couple in Iowa, one in Colorado, one in Nebraska. This is not a small concern, is it, Lee?
No, this is big, and it really goes from what we had been concerned about from a demand standpoint in the market, and you could argue that's what prices had been really reflecting, the much lower prices was that demand. Now it's the supply chain impact, and really the supply chain is important for various reasons in this situation. One is ongoing production of meat products for consumers. And two, it's this continuity of business for livestock producers. And so, you know, when we're seeing a slowdown or some suspension in some of these slaughter facilities, that has potential to tremendously impact prices.
In fact, you captured that in this article that you and Glenn put together. You developed basically an idea of what a reduction in packing plant operation means to cattle prices, right?
That's exactly what we did. And we used historical slaughter levels and we compared what our slaughter levels are currently to what they have been in the last 3 years for that particular time period. So we don't really know the capacity of cattle slaughter in the United States. That isn't a measure that is released by USDA, but we can use those historical slaughter levels to get a pretty good idea of what the capacity is. And then if you're using that as the denominator, and then you're just using the slaughter within a particular week as that numerator, you can get a slaughter capacity utilization. And what we've seen when you graph that capacity slaughter utilization, that really that became really a near-term low in 2015 as we were really rebuilding that cattle herd. Cattle supplies got very tight. We didn't really change much in the number of slaughter facilities. And since that time, it's really increased. So what that shows is there's not too much of a cushion to absorb additional production if we lose some capacity in a relatively short period of time. We've seen that back in August with the fire in Holcomb that brought roughly 7% of that slaughter offline for a short period of time. And then when we take prices historically and run a really simple model, we can really estimate the impact of increases in slaughter capacity utilization or that decrease in capacity and how that impacts prices. And for cattle, we find that a 1% increase in capacity utilization or decrease in capacity corresponds with a 1.3% decrease in fed cattle prices. Now, if we look at, say, roughly a 20% decline, that would equate to about 26% decline in prices. Now, what's important here is we're not expecting that. If we would see a 20% decline, that just suggests what historically we've seen. And I think it's important that some of that already might be priced into the market as we've seen these prices significantly lower over the last several weeks. It could be anticipating this slowdown in slaughter.
So when you boil that all down, it's saying that the sooner those packing plants get back online, the far better. For if this is an extended suspension of packing activity, that could be extremely harmful to the market itself.
Certainly, and I think where we're seeing the biggest impact is in the negotiated trade. As we've seen, that's been some of the smallest since livestock mandatory reporting data became available. And so what that shows, when you see that slowdown in slaughter, that the committed cattle are the ones being slaughtered, and you're seeing really a pullback in the number of negotiated cattle. And that's what we've seen this last week, and you may be expected to see that over the next several weeks with this reduction in slaughter levels.
Let's hope this is not a prolonged situation. And by the way, the article that they have written on this material is really a good read, producers, assessing impact of packing plant utilization on livestock prices. They look at the hog side of that equation as well. In this write-up, it's at agmanager.info. You've also penned, Lee, another article recently on managing through COVID-19 for cattle producers. Unlike other commodities, cattle cannot be stored. Therefore, there's this need to keep cattle flowing and in the market channels. And you're basically encouraging producers to stay the course.
That's really I think all that can be done at this point, given what they can control. We're seeing life and business still must go on. I think what's important here is being able to manage, even though we're seeing this tremendous time. So to the best of their ability, we need to maintain the flow of animals. Now, that certainly has been impacted as we've seen this fed cattle slaughter slow down. The demand for cattle is somewhat out of the control of producers, but we still need to do the best we can. So a few things to highlight is I think still striving for that optimal market weight. There may be a tendency to delay those marketings as we're seeing these prices collapse. But I think it's still very important because you're adding costs if we're going to hold on to those animals, and you may not be increasing the revenue by doing that if we further see prices decline or the quality of those cattle decline.
It's something that you economists refer to as the marginal cost of gain, and that has to be watched very closely here. Again, staying current will help in that respect, you say.
Yep, that's the case. We're really looking at, are you going to market those cattle where marginal cost equals marginal gain? Now, when we're seeing these tremendous volatility in these markets, that's difficult to pinpoint that exact point, but we should still be striving as best we can to market these cattle as timely as possible. I think it's important, too, when you look from an aggregate industry standpoint. So far, the market is rather current. If we look at cattle on feed over 120 days, it is lower than a year ago levels. So it suggests that we do have a bit of a cushion there. But there's been times in the past where we went from current to really uncurrent rather quickly. You know, you could point back to fall of 2015, where you've seen all else equal an impact of potentially $5, $10, maybe more dollars per hundredweight on those cattle because the market got very uncurrent very quickly. And so I think it is very important to maintain those markings as best we can. And I think you're seeing some of that in the futures market, that June contract trading much lower than the April contract, anticipating those supplies to build up some.
And this goes obviously for the cattle feeding sector as well as other points along the production chain. The returns to finishing cattle aren't good at all right now, Lee, but not placing cattle may just aggravate the circumstances, you say.
That's the case, too. When you look here, I think it's important that we maintain some flexibility. I think we have that in the cattle industry, but to the best of our ability of producers, I think we do want to really maintain that flow of animals, so not delaying placements. You know, even if you're producing at a loss, if you're still able to cover variable costs and some fixed costs, you're losing less, at least in the short run. And then I think really importantly, this COVID-19 situation collapsed the markets. I think you could see a scenario where we're going to see a rebound in some of these prices as we get some more certainty and some positive factors in the market. Being in a position, having purchased those feeder cattle at relatively low prices, may set a producer up for profits once we do see that rebound.
Again, this is an article that Lee has put together, and it's well worth reviewing as well. Managing Through COVID-19. Search for it at the Iowa Beef Center out of Iowa State University. Lee, good thoughts and important matters to address here for our cattle producers. Many thanks. We'll talk again quite soon.
Thank you.
That from Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz on this week's Cattle Market segment here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Next for you on this Agriculture Today, more input for you cow-calf producers who are hopefully finishing up your spring calving and now looking ahead to spring breeding and assuring that your bull power is up to the task. That's our topic now with Sandy Johnson. Sandy, a beef cattle specialist with K-State Research and Extension. She is based in Northwest Kansas for the university. Alluding here, Sandy, to a breeding soundness examination for bulls. And you would recommend this, before we get into the particulars of it, not only for yearling bulls and their first go-round, but for mature bulls as well?
That's right. We need to check bulls before the breeding season, regardless of age. And, you know, as you look at studies including bull age with breeding soundness exams, you clearly see semen quality decrease in those older bulls, and it's not going to always be at the same time. And so they're not good forever, and don't be trusting when it comes to turning out bulls. Verify that everything's in order.
Well, for this, one would typically enlist the services of their veterinarian to conduct a BSE, but let's go right through the components of the exam that are absolutely necessary.
Right. We typically think of that semen collection and evaluation, which, of course, is a very important component, but other parts include a scrotal circumference measurement. And, you know, as we look at a lot of bull data, it's very clear that scrotal circumference is a good indicator of sperm production and quality. And, of course, in young bulls, it helps us get an idea of their reproductive maturity. So that's an important component of it. And of course, there are some disease conditions that become apparent when you palpate the scrotum and find differences in either the testis or the epididymis that are abnormal. And that really brings us to another really important part of that breeding soundness exam, and that is a complete physical exam to include eyes, legs, and feet, because seeing, mobility, athleticism really is important to that bull getting the job done. So we need to make that a part of that evaluation. And then another part of that physical evaluation is to palpate those bulls and make sure those internal reproductive organs are sound. Sometimes we get a vesiculitis, and that would be picked up on, well, in this case, palpation as well as a semen evaluation.
When going through all of those points of examination, do we find that there's one single factor that typically turns up that ends up failing the bull in the exam, or does it vary so much?
There's just a lot of variation there. Yeah, it just depends on the situation. And the only consistent thing probably is young bulls around the time of puberty and some of the things you see in those bulls. But after that, it can be fairly wide open on what they present with.
Since you bring that up, if a bull does fail the test, is there reason to think about retesting that bull and maybe bringing him back into the sire power battery a little later on in the breeding season?
There certainly is in some cases. Young bulls are often classified as deferred, and in another month or two, that semen quality may be where you need it. And in that case, you have a good indication that they're just a little less mature at the time you're testing them. And then in terms of more mature bulls, if we knew, for example, they were sick and ran a fever for some reason, then we might give that classification as deferred and bring them back and retest it, or some injury. But then it would just be case by case how the animal presented and what might be the chance of any recovery.
But sometimes, Sandy, and you know producers so well, it's a tough call for that individual if a bull, particularly a mature bull, doesn't make the grade through the exam, to remove that bull from the herd because of the proven genetics that have already been vested in that bull. It is difficult, but be true to the test and make your decisions accordingly.
Right. If a bull does not pass this exam, you just think about you're turning out a bull that may not be able to sire any calves. The number of calves you have to market at weaning time is a huge driver of income. And so it's just hard to make that risk. And with our ability to use reproductive technology, I think we have a lot of good bulls available. And if one has some kind of failure in reproductive performance, I just don't think we can want to take that risk. We need a good, sound, able-bodied bull to cover those cows.
Now, another thing that you stress, Sandy, that there is more to bull preparation for the forthcoming breeding season than just the breeding soundness examination. Nutrition, pretty important here too, you say.
Right. Sometimes we may be roughing those bulls through the winter just a little bit, but we want to keep in mind that it takes about 60 days for sperm production to occur from start to finish as we might look at it. And so those 60 days prior to the breeding season, we really want to think about having that bull in good flesh. We know that body condition influences semen quality. Bulls that are thin have poor semen quality. And so if we had a yearling bull that we used as a yearling with a group of bulls, maybe that now 2-year-old bull is a little thinner if he's not fed separately. Those bulls in particular are still growing. And as we look at some larger data sets, we see that in poor semen quality in, say, 2-year-old bulls compared to 1s and 3s because they worked hard and have not had the opportunity to catch back up. Probably that depends on your ability to separate bull ages and bulls from cows and manage those bulls as they need. But the important thing is to remember we need those bulls in good breeding condition, and that now is a good time to be working on increasing that body condition if they were thin coming through the winter or were young and still growing, needing a little more energy. So make sure you allow yourself enough time to do that and think about that time period it takes to start and complete that semen production. You want them in good flesh as they're producing those cells for the start of your breeding season.
By the same token, can one actually overcondition a bull heading into the breeding season, overdo this, so to say?
Yes, you can. There's fewer observations of those overconditioned bulls, but when we look at situations where there's too much fat around the scrotum, that insulation can reduce semen quality. We see that sometimes in yearling bulls that are on a pretty high energy diet. So good condition but not obese, and generally it's not economical to make them obese, but sometimes there's conditions where those things do occur. But, beyond a body condition score 6, we're spending money that we probably don't need to spend in addition to being detrimental to semen quality.
All right. But to pull it all together, having a close working relationship with your veterinarian on certainly the breeding soundness examination and maybe input on other things such as nutrition, etc., would be very valuable to assure the soundness of that bull going in.
That's right. I know nobody really likes to have to handle bulls, but we do need to perform this exam and a good time to make those vaccinations and any other procedures appropriate for health and management of those bulls. And sometimes I think for producers it seems like a bitter pill to have to deal with those bulls, but I think it's worth the effort, and I just don't think we want to take the risk of turning bulls out that are not able to complete the job. I mean, we have enough trouble with them getting injured during the breeding season, let alone turning out one that wasn't ready to go to start with. One other thing I should mention, Eric, think about the breeding soundness exam. What it does not include is a test of serving capacity or libido. We've not been able to come up with a repeatable test to do that. So it's very important then for producers, once the breeding season starts, is to make sure those bulls are actually completing the job they've been sent out to. You want to see them work, complete a mating, and not leave that part for granted either, because, like I said, unfortunately we don't have a good test there, and we know particularly for young bulls there's some learning involved. So don't forget to follow through once the breeding season starts.
Well, it's always a quick turnaround from calving season to breeding season for our producers, but they need to be getting this on their plate pretty quickly. That is, checking out their bulls to make sure they're good to go. Good input right here. As always, Sandy, we appreciate the time and the information. Many thanks to you.
Glad to be here.
That from Sandy Johnson, beef cattle specialist with K-State Research and Extension, on the value of conducting that breeding soundness examination in your bull battery as spring breeding comes on. Producers, we'll step aside now for a few moments. When we come back, we'll have today's agricultural news headlines for you, and important information for all associated with the 4-H program here in Kansas during our weekly 4-H segment. That's still ahead here on Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here, and continuing on now with today's agricultural news headlines, these courtesy in part of DTN. Smithfield Foods announced yesterday that company was closing its Sioux Falls, South Dakota facility indefinitely after state officials reported that the plant accounted for 40% of all COVID-19 cases in the state of South Dakota, and that state's governor on Saturday demanded that the plant close for at least 2 weeks. Smithfield previously announced it would suspend operations at the plant for 3 days. South Dakota's State Department of Health on Saturday reported that 238 of the state's 626 coronavirus cases involved workers at the Smithfield plant. Packing plants around the country now are among the most significant hotspots for COVID-19. Tyson, Cargill, JBS, National Beef, and other major packers have also each faced similar shutdown scenarios. On Friday, JBS announced it would close its Greeley, Colorado beef plant for at least 3 days after 36 workers there had tested positive. Colorado media were reporting 2 workers from that plant had died. Smithfield employs 3,700 workers in Sioux Falls, and that plant, formerly known as the John Morrell plant, accounts for roughly 5% of all pork production in the U.S. Smithfield states the plant produces 130 million servings of food per week, and more than 550 hog producers deliver stock to the plant. Now, while packing plant workers have become victims to the virus or fearful that they may contract it, it is important to note that the Food and Drug Administration states there is no evidence that food or food packaging is associated with transmission of the coronavirus. Another JBS plant in Grand Island, Nebraska, also has seen at least 28 workers test positive for COVID-19. And Tyson announced last week it was temporarily closing an Iowa pork plant because of a high volume of positive cases, while National Beef made the same decision for a beef plant in Iowa. The Wall Street Journal reported that the administration is looking at ways to test workers and find other ways to ensure that workers will continue to process food during the pandemic. Meantime, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue said via Twitter that the agency would be expanding its investigation into cattle market activity to include the most recent price movements that took place in the wake of the COVID-19 situation. Quoting the Secretary on social media, USDA's Packers and Stockyards Division will be extending our oversight to determine the causes of divergence between boxed and live beef prices, beginning with the Holcomb fire in Kansas last summer and now with COVID-19, in Perdue's tweet. Scores of lawmakers have been pressing the USDA to take the action after record moves in beef prices as consumer panic buying pushed up beef demand. But despite the increased dressed beef prices, live cattle prices actually declined. And even as market attention is mostly on the COVID-19 situation, some are noting now that the trade data for the first 2 months of 2020 indicate that China is behind on the pace needed to meet their commitments under the Phase 1 trade deal to boost their imports of U.S. agricultural goods. The Trump administration, over the next few weeks, will give an assessment of the current Phase 1 developments, but public information is forthcoming on the deal as the agreement calls for the U.S. and China to make public disclosures on quarterly exports and imports. Reports are that a call between U.S. and Chinese officials was postponed 2 weeks ago after President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping were scheduled to talk via telephone on March the 27th. U.S. officials are said to be remaining cautiously content with China's progress toward buying American products and opening the domestic market for U.S. firms. So what has been the price effect so far of disruptions in delivery of food to supermarkets? That answer may surprise you, the USDA's Gary Crawford tells us.
Yes, grocery shoppers have been running across some low stocks and even empty shelves of some food items.
But if we look at the prices, we weren't seeing big price swings.
Agriculture Department economist Gianna Short talking about the new Consumer Price Index, which covers March. Now, it does show a 0.4% drop in the price index for all goods in the economy, steepest monthly decline in over 5 years. But again,
the food sector, especially at the grocery stores, remained relatively stable.
Overall, grocery store food prices did go up, but only by 0.5%. Some items rose more than that, eggs, for example, but even so, wholesale egg prices tripled in March. But at the grocery store,
egg prices only went up 1.7%.
Milk didn't go up at all, and even ground beef, which stores have been having trouble stocking, didn't increase that much.
Ground beef went up 1.4%.
So Gianna Short says right now stores may be a little short on supplies, but shoppers are not seeing big run-ups in prices. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Well, as the health risk of COVID-19 continues, K-State Research and Extension announced late last week that it is extending its suspensions of all face-to-face extension programs, meetings, and events through July the 4th. Now, that suspension was originally scheduled through May the 16th. As a result, events coordinated by the state 4-H office are also affected. The state leader for 4-H youth development at K-State, Wade Weber, says this move by extension does not include county fairs because those fairs are governed by local county boards. However, Wade says that Kansas 4-H and extension professionals are looking now at alternative methods that would enable 4-H youth to still showcase their projects.
Currently, our partnerships with the county fair and extension is a long-standing partnership. We continue to have that partnership going forward. As we think about the options for showcasing in the county during the summer, that decision, for the most part, will be made outside of that July 4th restriction of activities. We'll continue to monitor the situation and make determinations as to 4-H's role going forward. It's our hope and desire that we would be able to participate as fully as we can. We are going to be purposing over the next month to explore opportunities for virtual showcases in a whole host of areas and to be sharing that with our county fair partners as we go forward. And so I'm optimistic for us going forward that we'll be using this time to think creatively about where we need to go for the future. But specifically, county fair decisions are a local decision, but we are going to continue to monitor the situation and be giving advice and clarifying the role of 4-H youth development in that partnership in the local county fair.
There will be more from K-State's Wade Weber on these newly announced Kansas 4-H activity changes in our weekly 4-H segment with Jeff Wickman. That's coming up right after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues, K-State Research and Extension is extending its suspension of all face-to-face extension programs, meetings, events, and activities, including Kansas 4-H, through July 4th. State leader for 4-H youth development, Wade Weber, says he and his staff are identifying alternative ways to serve 4-H youth.
As we enter into this unprecedented time, it's with a heavy heart that we have to anticipate and change the way in which we deliver many of our summer programming options and our spring options going forward. So, as you know from the directives from Director for Extension, that our prohibition is now extended through July 4th. That does affect our Discovery Days event, which is on campus, hosting for high schoolers, also affects our 4-H camps. We have events called Camp Friends, our Insect Spectacular, geology field trips, shooting sports programs, matches, as well as a few district horse shows and dog shows, as well as our Shutterbug events in person. While those things are in their current form are not going to happen, with each of those events, we're currently purposing to reformat them and think of options for them going forward. For instance, the Discovery Days team right now is working to talk with our speaker as well as many of our workshop and presenters to continue to have those learning opportunities be transferred into a virtual format that we'll invite high schoolers to. I know that the Insect Spectacular entomology team is working on creating a virtual engagement option that would be made available to all 4-Hers across the state as well to continue to encourage them to get out, do their insect collections, get outdoors and be exploring and looking for ways to identify those things properly, and then also talk about alternative ways to put their displays together. And that's just two examples. I know each of our project teams are going to be purposing over the next month for sure to refine those options that were, canceled in order to reformat them into a new option and then make that available to young people across the state here this spring. The goal is for continued engagement. It's not for a suspension of activities as much as it's a recontextualization of our activities going forward, because the mission of 4-H remains the same and will continue to press forward.
Right, you're really wanting the 4-H youth to continue their projects and to continue to move forward and continue to learn on their own and find other ways to get feedback.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, we're looking at asking young people, how do you continue to identify an area of interest, to create some goals, some plans around how you would like to engage in that learning. Many of these projects have been going on since the fall, and so we want to continue to encourage that deepening of learning, the ability to interact with content-rich, whether they be peers or adults in their community, but just realizing that the method in which we go about engagement is changing. But I've been really encouraged by the ways in which our 4-H clubs have been transitioning into a virtual platform, even project talks that are being available in a virtual platform. Our volunteers are continuing to reach out and connect with families and encourage that learning going forward. That's really the spirit of 4-H and those who serve in 4-H, and I'm really proud of that fact and proud of the ways in which people are adapting for us going forward.
There may be some things that are a little bit more easily adaptable for technology, but some of the other things like horse shows and dog shows, even those have a possibility of still being able to take place in one form or another?
Well, we're definitely exploring that. There are resources available out there. Currently, we're organizing our own KSRE professionals around exploring those options. One thing that's unique about this phenomena right now is that this is not just isolated to Kansas and the 4-H program in Kansas, but rather this, because of the global nature of this, is that 4-H programs across the United States are asking very similar questions. And I'm really excited and proud to be a part of a youth development organization that is affiliated with the land-grant university system, to realize that we have the entire firepower, so to speak, of the nation's land-grant universities thinking about this problem and really asking ourselves, how can we leverage resources to continue to enhance the engagement of those local caring adults, volunteers, as they interact with local families in project-based learning. I've never been more proud of our organization and to realize the resources that we're leveraging to think creatively, to think collectively about providing those showcase opportunities so that young people truly can have a capstone experience for their project-based learning, but also some introductory ways to maybe encourage young people to discover something that maybe they hadn't discovered before through 4-H project learning opportunities.
You have your 4-H staff, but you also work with extension agents across the state in terms of getting a lot of these project areas accomplished. So you do have really a lot of brains to tap here as you look for solutions.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the huge strengths of the extension system in Kansas is that we have been in communities for over 115 years now, being with communities as they go through local community challenges, or as we're seeing in this case, more of a global challenge across the board. Our commitment is steadfast. Our mission remains the same. We are here to continue to enhance the quality of life of all aspects of our community. So we're looking forward to continuing to engage our community in creative ways, giving young people opportunities to learn and being able to celebrate their accomplishments as they make progress in their own personal learning.
Well, this was certainly not an easy decision to make, not a decision that was made lightly, but we do have to consider the health of everyone involved.
Absolutely. In our 4-H pledge, we pledge our health to better living, and then we say for our club, our community, our country, and our world. And I can't think of a more appropriate response to the 4-H pledge than the decisions that we're having to make at this time. It's making decisions for our own personal behavior in order to benefit others. So what we talk about when we talk about civic engagement in 4-H, and to me, this is a unique opportunity for us to put that into practice.
And we should point out that as things move forward, 4-H and Extension in general will be keeping everyone informed of what's going on, so they'll know there won't be any surprises.
Absolutely. It's our commitment to communicate well and communicate often, and to inform people as we monitor the situations and make adjustments. It's our hope that things will continue to progress better than we anticipate. But we also understand that as leaders, that it's our responsibility to prepare for, in some cases, the worst. So we are optimistic, but we want to be purposeful in planning as well. Our mission continues to be the same, and as we change our methodology of engagement, as one person on a call shared with me this week, 4-H is not taking a break. 4-H is still open for business. Our methods are changing and shifting, but our mission is not taking a break.
That's State Leader for 4-H Youth Development, Wade Weber. Again, for updated information regarding 4-H programming, visit kansas4h.org. 4-H youth and families are also encouraged to follow their local clubs through various social networking channels. And that'll do it for the Monday edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.